It's roughly about time to kick off, so thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to see so many people. My name's Sophie. I'm a lecturer here in the School of Philosophy, and I'm one of the co-organisers for this public lecture series, Big Ideas in Education, Past, Present and Future. Now, this is the third in this series. Previously, we heard from Professor John Elliott about Lawrence Stenhouse. We heard from myself and Dr. Victoria Shoanami 2 weeks ago now, talking about inclusivity and diversity in higher education. Both of those are now available online in case you missed them on YouTube. They're excellent. I thoroughly recommend them. Definitely an hour well spent. But tonight we have Dr. Geoffrey Hinchliffe from the School of Education, who's going to be talking about instrumentalism and focusing in particular on secondary education. Now, Geoff has worked with the School of Education for 10 years now? 10 years?
Yeah.
Yes, 10 years. Teaching educational theory, particularly to first-year students. He's the author of Liberty in Education. He's going to talk today, and then just after his paper, he's actually going to have a conversation with a couple of our finest philosophy students, third-year philosophy students, who are going to discuss a little bit about their memories of their secondary school education, given that it was not so long ago, right, Tom? Right, so later you'll be meeting Tom Barber, and then streaming in to join us tonight will be Jeanette Birkentel. So, without further ado, Geoff, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the evening.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm supposed to be mic'd up here, so can everyone hear me at the back? Yes? Good, okay. Well, when I thought about this, I was thinking that we decided to try and make the lectures public so that anyone could come to these lectures, not just people from the university, anyone from Norwich is welcome. And then I thought, well, perhaps people might not understand quite what instrumental means. They might think that education is full of children and teenagers playing flutes and piccolos and playing oboes and bassoons. Might be that sort of instrumental. And so it might all be rather jolly. But unfortunately not. By an instrumental, we need to think of an instrument. For example, the government might have a statutory instrument by which it promulgates certain requirements, for example, regarding public health. In other words, the instrument is a means to an end with a definite result. And that's what I mean by instrumental in this context. Now, in philosophy, the term instrumental became widely associated with the German critical theory school, the Frankfurt critical theory school that arose in the 20s and 1930s and then had to decamp to Los Angeles and New York. And their use of instrumental was the idea that that under capitalism, reason had lost its critical and emancipatory power, and that reason was merely at the service of capitalism and the state. That the use of reason was merely to effect technological change and to work out the best way of exchanging commodities. And so they came up with the idea of reason being instrumental rather than being emancipatory. Now, you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to give you a whole lecture on the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, fascinating though that is, because I think that would take us down too many rabbit holes and take us away from too much from education as such. So the idea of what is instrumentality, it's the idea that education is construed as a means to an end. And that can be construed in quite wide terms. For example, quite often the purpose of education is seen in social engineering terms, to bring about greater fairness and social justice. I think that Michael Gove, when he was Secretary of State for Education, often used to talk about the way in which schools could provide equal opportunities for children, so that schools became the vehicle for social mobility, and teachers were charged with that particular responsibility. And of course, as we are probably all familiar, the economic role of education is stressed time after time in government white papers, and especially in terms of the role of employability. And it's interesting that the term employability is something that has surfaced quite largely in the last 20 years or so. I don't think it was used quite so much, say, 30 or 40 years ago. So that employers become the proxy drivers of educational practice. In other words, figuring out what employers want, talking to employers. The Times newspaper ran a commission on education, and the commission was composed of 25 people. All of them no doubt very worthy people. But over half of them were drawn from the employment and business sector. There was actually one practicing teacher on the whole panel. And rather predictably, what did the Times Commission come up with? It came up with the idea that schools should have more, teach technology much more. So that's a kind of pure instrumental approach to education. And more recently, when I was looking through a policy document, Educational Excellence Everywhere from 2016, it said that investing in our education system is an investment in the future of our nation, as if education was instrumental in a mission of national salvation. So how is that experienced? Well, I suppose the most obvious way is the wide variety of tests and exams that every child experiences from the age of 7 onwards. And this may become even earlier if plans for earlier teaching are come to fruit. And of course, of the significance attached to this testing by schools, by parents, by government, and of course the children themselves who are made aware of the significance of these tests. For example, the SAT, the Standard Attainment Test, the first one of which is taken year 7. Another aspect of it is the narrowing of the curriculum, with an emphasis on core subjects, leaving little time for other pursuits. So 30 or 40 years ago, the national curriculum came into being, and that was quite a broad document. People complained that it was too detailed, but actually what we're left with now is a much narrow focus, and many academies are quite content to focus mainly, and in some cases exclusively, on core subjects of literacy, numeracy and science and technology. And then finally, there's a pedagogy driven by learning outcomes, so that teachers themselves become more instrumental in their thinking, or at least that's the plan, so that lessons are designed and constructed and planned in terms of hitting those learning outcomes. So that the mentality of many children and students, and this is what we experience at the university as the students come in for the first time to university education, the mentality is such that the primary experience of education is in terms of testing and marks. And knowledge, understanding and creativity, which is what we're about, hopefully, at the university, tend to get reduced to a discourse on skills, and understanding is dismissed in terms of talk about content. That teachers are often confined to preset learning aims with a reduced scope for exploration of topics of interest. And then finally, of course, the inspection regime, Ofsted, ensures that schools focus on learning gain, measured in terms of marks achieved. And for Ofsted, this is a bottom line. The reputation of the school and all those who work in it depends on this. I came across this esteemed person, Ai Weiwei, a Chinese artist currently in exile from his home country, China, currently living in Portugal, I believe. And he's a critic not only of Chinese society, but of Western society too. And he says here, education is basically trying to teach people how to be useful. It is about trying to provide the right workforce for different professions, rather than teaching people to recognise their own sense of rightness or beauty or creative activity. But how have we got to this place? What are the drivers? Well, if we look at a very brief history of education in England since 1944, we can see that, as far as I can make out, there are three phases. The first phase is of selective and traditional education, which in effect produced a kind of educational apartheid through the 11+ test. It's true, many of the grammar schools provided a good liberal education, but that was only for 20% of children or thereabouts. The progressive education stage, roughly from 64 to 1980, came about with the election of the Labour government in 1964. And that was, I call that progressive simply because, first of all, it did its best to encourage schools to become mixed ability, so that they became a comprehensive school, or in America what you would call a common school. And secondly, there was a degree of encouragement of experimental pedagogy, I think typified in the Plowden report that reported in 1967, which actually said, and I'm just quoting from memory in here, that not all aspects of understanding and creativity can be measured. But then finally, 1980 and 1922 is state-directed educational provision. And I call it state-directed because one of the things that happened with the advent of the Thatcher government was that local authorities were gradually stripped of their powers to educate locally. And that their place was taken by, in effect, the Department of Education. At the same time, the inspection regime which was conducted by HMIs, which had a respectable and venerable tradition to it, were replaced by Ofsted, which, and we'll have a closer look at Ofsted in a minute. There was the emergence of the academy schools, and at the same time, any kind of experimental pedagogies were strongly discouraged. And if I can just recall those times, there was a consistent attack on any kind of progressive education or experimental pedagogy. For example, Melanie Phillips, the Times correspondent, wrote a book in which she attacked John Dewey and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, amongst other people. Her understanding of those people were utterly woeful, but that wasn't the point of the book. The point of the book was to denigrate and undermine any kind of progressive education. And at the same time, of course, education was seen as something that was economically essential. And so there was a consistent approach to drive up standards. So those are the three phases, and the phase that we're still living in, the reforms promulgated by the Thatcher government, are by and large still with us, and have been increased and developed further under successive governments. And I always like this quote from Rousseau. The wisest writers devote themselves to what a man ought to know without asking what a child is capable of learning. They're always looking for the man in the child without considering what he is before he becomes a man. And what Rousseau is trying to say is that there is a value in childhood and in teenagehood in its own right. And we don't have to look upon it always as simply a journey to adulthood. I think that's what the Plowden report successfully captured, that idea. So the current state of education today is undoubtedly in part the product of a political trajectory in which concerns that were expressed 50 years ago get reprised today. But I think there are also deeper underlying trends that might be termed features of modernity, which permeate the experience of education and schooling for all those involved. And there's three figures in particular I would like to discuss. The first is Max Weber, sociologist, still a sociologist of considerable renown, and the rationalisation of education. So, one of the things that Weber was interested in was the growth of bureaucracy. And Weber thought the growth of bureaucracy was an indelible feature of modernity permeating all areas of life. And I guess that Weber thought that, for example, the Marxist theory, the idea of class struggle, had sort of slightly got it wrong, because from a Weberian point of view, even if the workers won the class struggle, there would still be bureaucracy. And that the bureaucratic mentality and bureaucratic instruments were part and parcel of not just a modern capitalist state, but a modern industrialist state. And of course, we're all familiar with the basic features of bureaucratic arrangements. And of course, there are benefits, which I won't overemphasize, but there are benefits to bureaucratic arrangements in terms of predictability, in terms of a level of service that can be expected. But Weber was also emphasised the growth of a certain mentality that bureaucratic structures require. And it's this mentality, I think, which has gradually invaded schooling and even possibly the university today. And I think that for quite a long time, education kept the Weberian bureaucratic mentality at bay. But eventually, the bureaucratic mentality took a hold. And so the mentality includes the development of techniques to reproduce predicted behaviours, so that these are internalised in the person. And a social and vocational world configured so the efficacy of such techniques become progressively easier to achieve. And then finally, crucially, the construction of a self whose personality is characterised by methodical conduct. And you can see this in the obvious ways in terms of the regimentation of the school day and so on. But I think that from a Weberian point of view, it's the very act of learning induces a bureaucratic mentality. For example, thinking of learning in terms of learning outcomes, thinking of learning in terms of having to plan beforehand the lesson in some detail. That is all part and parcel of the growth of a bureaucratic mentality, which I submit has invaded and colonised much of the school sector. As an example of this, a relatively recent publication on schools, that is a policy document endorsed by the government. It's a report that sets out the kind of leadership that struggling schools require. And so, for example, on page 57 of that report is a case study of one particular school, a struggling school, a school that needs further development, where it's observed that, quote, there is no evidence that targets have been set, and that therefore a new leadership needs to go in so that targets are to be created from objectives by the end of the week. And throughout the 120-page document, there's no discussion on what is to be taught. There's no discussion on the kind of values to be promulgated in the school, other than the values associated with a bureaucratic mentality that I've just been talking about. And it's assumed throughout that struggling schools have a deficiency in effective rationalisation, a rationalisation deficit, in which weak leadership fails to plan and set measurable goals. So the kind of thinking, the mentality that's bound up in a bureaucracy was turned by Weber the notion of rationalisation. Not rationality, he wasn't against rationality, but rationalisation he saw as something to be possibly regretted. And at the end of his seminal work, Protestant Ethic, that's the work that looks at the way in which early capitalism developed through the Protestant nonconformist churches. At the end of that book, Weber famously invokes the iron cage, which modern man had constructed for himself, signifying the development of procedures and behaviours necessary for a modern economic order. Whilst, he says, quote, the rosy blush of its laughing air, the Enlightenment, seems to be irretrievably fading. And the metaphor of the iron cage, of a humankind imprisoned by a narrow rationality that it itself has fashioned, that humankind has fashioned, can be seen as our modern fate. It's to be noticed, by the way, in passing, that Weber doesn't think that rationalisation emerged automatically from the Enlightenment. He distinguished between the Enlightenment on the one hand and the growth of rationalisation, which he saw as a phenomenon that arose particularly in the 19th and 20th century. And I think that what is particularly interesting is that Weber died in 1920. He wrote he formulated these ideas in the 1890s and early 1900s, and yet he could be talking about today exactly. Well, the next figure, I think, is this chap. Here we have a nice smile on his face. There's some of the things he talks about, there's not much to laugh at, to be perfectly honest. But there he is, and a jolly fine set of teeth as well. And I always think, I think Foucault is an amazing intellectual. I don't agree with everything he said, by any means, but I think he's an amazing intellectual because he was one of these people who never stopped. He never reprised, he never went over old ideas and recapped them. He was always moving on. He was always full of fresh ideas. I always think of him as a Miles Davis of philosophy, always developing, always original, always trying to improvise. And he was interested in this notion of the Panopticon. And I dare say these days people know a little bit about the Panopticon, but how to control without lifting a finger the power of the gaze. And there we have it, constructed by apparently Jeremy Bentham, this idea, in which all the cells are in a circular, in a sphere, and at the centre there is where you just need one warder to control things, because the warder can see into every single cell of every single prisoner. And so because they can see through the power of the gaze, the behaviour of the prisoner is controlled. Why? Because they're always seen and they can't hide. There weren't that many panopticons as such constructed, But I think that Foucault uses it more as a metaphor for the gaze and the way in which the gaze is used to control and sometimes used to empower people, of course. And Foucault was particularly interested in the idea of what he called disciplinarity, social disciplinarity. It's nothing to do with subject disciplines, it's more to do with disciplining and self-disciplining. And in his book Discipline and Punish, he investigated the origins of disciplinarity in 18th century institutions. And he's a very, how can I put it, very succinct but quite compressed writing. This enclosed segmented space observed at every point in which individuals are inserted in a fixed place, in which the slightest movements are supervised, in which all events are recorded, in which an uninterrupted work of writing links the centre and the periphery, in which power is exercised without division according to a continuous hierarchical figure, in which, and this is a crucial bit, in which each individual is constantly located, examined and distributed among the living beings. All this constitutes a compact model of the disciplinary mechanism. And that's from Discipline and Punish, available in Penguin, indeed. So of course Ofsted is what we might be thinking of here, the gaze, and he is an Ian, senior school manager in a piece of work that was done, and I do like this little statement here. I'll let you read it. I won't read it out. So I think Ian's experience is not unusual. In fact, I think that many teachers, present and retired, would recognise what's going on there. There's a certain game that you have to play, and eventually you get good at doing it. As he says, I think we got very, very good at doing it according to the Ofsted model, and we had to do that, and we did do that. So tick, well done, Ian. But the point, of course, is that, as I say, resistance is futile, because Ian is still conforming. He's still complying. I mean, at least Ian's got the sense to know what's going on, so that's a good for Ian. But the problem is that Ian is bound up in this disciplinary mechanism that Foucault describes so well, with such concision. And Ian and others like him can do very little about it. And of course, I'm well aware that Ofsted is not full of ogres. For one thing, my brother was an Ofsted inspector, and he was an HMI. And he's not an ogre, although we do have had some lively discussions on the role of Ofsted, I must say. He pointed out to me that Ofsted no longer enforces the 3-part lesson, for example, which is good to hear. And I certainly know that Ofsted has some good people in it, and not even the Secretary of State of Education can control what goes on in every classroom. But you could argue that Ofsted still retains its gaze when it's not present, and that it has in effect a kind of policing role. And who is it policing? It's not policing the children, it's policing the teachers. That's what it's there for. So that teaching needs to be conducted in a risk-averse way if it is to be safe and stress-free. And it involves planning and sticking to the plan, and be sure your plans have lots of learning targets, and be sure that you have all the documentary evidence you need to cover your back. And I think we still get Ofsted Inspections which surprise one really, because sometimes they're okay, and yet not that long ago I was talking to a chair of a fairly large secondary school who'd been recently Ofsteded. This is in the last few months, and we said that the Ofsted inspectors were rude, unsympathetic, and uninterested in what the teachers had to say. And that surprised me, because I thought that Ofsted had moved on a little bit from the bad old days, but it still seems that those bad old days are still with us, at least up to a point. Well, the third person I want to talk about before I finish is another Frenchman. I'm sorry about this. For all you Brexiteers, we've got one German and two Frenchmen. I hope that's okay. Leotard and transactional knowledge. And back in the 1970s, he wrote a book called The Postmodern Condition. And in it, it seems to me that it's one of the most prescient books ever written in terms of what is happening right now in the 2020s. His first notion was that postmodern times, he doesn't use the term postmodernity very much in the book actually, but he thinks that first of all they've shattered traditional grand narratives such as the Enlightenment, such as progress, such as humanism. And he gives us the reasons as to why he thinks that is the case. It's because of the commodification of knowledge. So we're used to the idea of commodification of things, commodification of services. What he was saying is that now it's knowledge itself that is commodified. Knowledge is produced in order to be sold, consumed in order to be validated in production. And in both cases, the consumption and the production is knowledge, is exchange. And knowledge therefore ceases to be an end in itself. So the link between education and emancipation is broken. And so that renders liberal education a thing of the past. So the purpose of education in postmodern times, that is our times, is to enable people to use knowledge bundles which are often owned by international corporations rather than nation states. When Leotard wrote that book, he had no idea what was going to happen with terms of Facebook and the like. And the question to be asked of knowledge is no longer, is it true, but rather what use can be made of it. And he doesn't use the term transactional knowledge, but so that's me. But that's my way of characterising his understanding of knowledge. Transactional knowledge puts into question the idea of knowledge for its own sake. And if knowledge is essentially transient, it doesn't make sense for individuals to spend years in detailed learning. The instrumental approach to learning makes much more sense. In-depth understanding is rarely required. What's needed is a smartness to see what use can be made of a piece of knowledge, what resources are needed, and what the demands on time are likely to be in terms of learning. And anyone who takes knowledge for its own sake too seriously are themselves not to be taken too seriously. Indeed, they are naive survivors from a previous age. And the organisation of knowledge then reflects its transactional nature. For example, the modular structure of a curriculum easily lends itself to the view that learning can be neatly packaged. And here I'm thinking now of our own university. With transactional knowledge, learning no longer transforms the individual. For the aim of transactional knowledge is to transform organisations. And then once these are in place, individual motivations will follow accordingly. And of course, it's always been the case that some knowledge is used pragmatically for specific ends in view. I completely grant that, but what is new, according to Leotard, is that the principal feature or element or dimension of knowledge is its transactional character. And so he says he invented this horrible word, performativity, which is essentially the pursuit of results. It's about the ability to use knowledge bundles for a particular purpose to achieve a prescribed result through skill or competency. And so education focuses on performance rather than understanding. This entails a focus on learning outcomes that can be translated into measurable competencies and skills. And in that way, students are made ready for the knowledge economy. And in one book by a colleague of mine, Winch, he says that the teacher is thereby transformed into what he terms an executive technician, whose job it is to execute these pre-programmed packages of teaching and knowledge. So my argument then, in conclusion, is that the kind of processes identified by Weber, Foucault and Lyotard have shaped education as experienced today at all levels, including the university. But I would argue that these processes have been greatly assisted by the zeal in which successive secretaries of state of all parties, as well as school managers and some educational researchers, have actively promoted these trends, especially in state schools and particularly in the academies. It hasn't just all happened by accident, and it hasn't all been unintentional either. And it follows that the experience of education will only change, I would submit, if the state has less involvement than it does at the moment. You remember that I said in the 3 stages of education since 1944, we're still in the 3rd stage, which I referred to as state-directed education, in which local authorities were stripped of their responsibilities, for the most part. It also means, first of all, placing more trust in teachers and giving them greater professional autonomy. And I'm not an expert on the education system of Finland, but it's noticeable, first of all, that Finland always seems to do quite well in the PISA tables, and secondly, that the teachers have considerable autonomy, social status, and they're well paid, and they're trusted to get on with the job, and that doesn't happen here. Ensure that all teachers have much greater opportunity for development, both in terms of pedagogy and subject discipline. I don't think that the training for teachers should just be all about pedagogy. I think teachers need to refresh their understanding of their own particular subject discipline, whether it's science or English or history or whatever it might be. The core subjects requirement, I would suggest, needs to be dropped in order to encourage a broader curriculum. And something like a National Curriculum Council needs to be appointed on which teachers have significant representation. There used to be a body called the Schools Council that operated for about 20 years, from 1964 until it was abolished by Keith Joseph, the Secretary of State for Education in the Thatcher government. And the role of the Schools Council, which was, by the way, populated the majority of people on it were from the teaching profession. Their role was to advise on the curriculum and on pedagogy and on schools policy. And we need something like that body revived. Not exactly, no doubt. No doubt it'll be different in some respects. I dare say there would be more stakeholders on it, but it needs a significant teacher representation. And then finally, the role of Ofsted needs to be changed so that it no longer becomes a policing operation and inspections become a little more about conversations between fellow professionals. I'm not against schools, school inspections. That's not what this is about. So I suggest keep the state out of education, set the teachers free, acknowledge in the way that the Plowden report did that testing is not the same as learning. And finally, make enjoyment the aim of learning. And when I say, I really mean that. I really mean that. That in government documents, the business of a happy child doesn't appear at all. But without happy children at school, they're not going to learn properly. Now, I think hopefully and mercifully, children find ways of making themselves happy under whatever regime they happen to be living in. They're adaptable and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, I think that schools should have that particular aim. So, that's almost the end of my lecture. For those of you interested, I've got a bibliography there. But I would just say finally that when I say that there's too much instrumentalism in education, I don't mean that education should be completely and totally non-instrumental. I totally get the fact that there is an aspect of education that needs to be instrumental, that students like to be able to achieve, and that teachers like to be achieved. And in education, there are no absolutes. So I'm not saying getting rid of all instrumentalism. What I'm saying is it just needs recalibrating. And at the moment, it's too far in one direction. And it needs turning back so we become less interested in instrumentality, more interested in education, and more interested in the happiness of the child and the teenager. Okay, thank you. Well, now we've got two students here, and I'm going to ask them for their opinions and any comments they have. And we thought about this because it's a long time since I've been at school, so it'd be good to talk to people who've been at school much more recently and have experienced some of the things, and they may have disagreements. So we've got one person, Tom, who's a philosophy student, and we've got another person here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, such as the miracles of technology. This student is called Jeanette. Hi, Jeanette. Can you see us? Right, okay.
That doesn't seem very loud.
No.
Oh.
If this goes okay, I'll be amazed, but you never know.
We should be able to hear Jeanette. Not very loudly.
Ah.
It was working earlier, wasn't it? Of course. Jeanette, could I ask you to say something else, please?
Sure, would you like me to reply to?
That's great.
Ah, good.
We've got it.
Right. So I've got Tom here and I've got Jeanette there. So I was wondering, Tom and Jeanette, is there anything I've said there that you recognise? Is there anything there that you disagree with? Is there anything there that you'd like to amplify? If I had to say, Tom, go first and then Jeanette.
Yeah. So your lecture definitely resonated with me. But a caveat to me is that I was educated in the private system. So I had a different experience to anybody in the state system. But it definitely resonated. And there was definitely a instrumentalist type of education in the private sector. There's definitely probably an overbearing state bureaucracy that affected that.
Right. Could you give an example?
So something I'm very passionate about is languages. And my experiences with languages is that we followed a very strict curriculum with regards to grammar and vocabulary, but we rarely focused on things like culture and history, which may not be the language itself, but definitely informs your knowledge of the language.
Right, yeah. So that was a kind of a narrowing pedagogical approach then?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Jeanette, is there anything that resonated with you in the lecture, or is there anything you'd like to disagree with me about?
A bit different to Tom. I did go to a public school, which later on became an academy, and what I noticed a lot from the teachers that they seemed really distressed with was that the aims and targets they had to reach were very inflexible and unrealistic often. Because the way our high school was, we had a lot of international students who had very little knowledge of English, and we had a lot of SEN students, and the targets they had to reach were very, very unrealistic, and they had no say in it.
Right.
So like, but my students don't know English. Yeah, but they need to get a B in English. But how do we manage that? And that seemed to happen in a lot of different classes. And as myself as a philosophy student, they wouldn't encourage my questions because I was always very curious and I wanted to know deeper about the subject. And about 9 times out of 10, I would be shut down. This is the curriculum, this is what we're studying today.
Right.
Don't ask outside of it, which is very discouraging.
So if you ask questions, if you ask too many questions, the problem with that is that from a teacher point of view is that you're starting to interfere with the lesson, which is to achieve the learning targets. Is that? Yeah, right. Did you find that at all? It's sometimes called targetology. Did you experience targetology in your school?
Yes, to a certain extent. With regards to like the PowerPoints, where they have the target set out straight away before you go into the lesson. I didn't have that as much in private education. But there were definitely targets to be met in each class.
Yeah. Right. And Jeanette, were you at school at all when Ofsted arrived? What was that? What was that like from the point of view of a school pupil?
It was very strange. Our school, unfortunately, did fall under the category of special measures.
Oh right.
And that's what we were cast.
Blimey.
For a year or two, or it was a period, and it was strange because you could see the teachers frantically trying to change something to get the results that they were looking for. And if there was an inspection, it was very much act like we never usually acted. It was very, very strange. It wasn't how we were taught normally. It was, oh, we have Ofsted this week.
Right.
Let's actually get all the paperwork done. Let's actually everybody behave. And either like all the naughty students that were like sent out even before the lesson started because you don't want to show the disobedient class.
Right.
It was
Okay.
yeah, it was a very strange experience.
So did you have Ofsted in your you presumably didn't experience this?
We must have had inspections, but if we did, they were invisible.
Right. Yeah.
I think there must have been people who came into the class, but
Right.
I don't.
One last thought is: did you think that your school education had adequately prepared you for university?
Yeah, I would say so. I think it's just the fact that, well, one of the aspects that definitely helped me was it was a boarding school. So I spent a lot of time away from home, and that definitely set me up for university.
Yeah. Okay. Jeanette, did you think your school prepared you for university?
I'm going to say no. Not in the ways that they intended to. I think sixth form was slightly more like how university is taught.
Right.
We had smaller classes, it was a bit more focused. But overall, the key point I got from school was you regurgitate a bunch of information for the exam, and then you never remember it again afterwards.
Right.
So a lot of teachers seem to miss that. That, yeah, but you did this last year in science. And then we just looked at a blank.
Right.
We don't remember what we did because we forget it.
And that's right, and that's the phenomenon of exams, of course, is that you study for the exams, but then as soon as the exam is over, you tend to forget. That's a common experience. Right, shall we throw it open to the audience? Do you want to sit? Do you want to stay here or sit down?
I don't mind.
Let's stay there. Yeah. Yes, I was wondering if there are any questions to either myself or my two student colleagues.
Would you like me to moderate?
Hello.
Would you like me to moderate the question?
Yeah.
I shall just sit with you.
Yeah, sure, thanks.
Hi. I'd like to ask, I totally agree with what you say that it needs recalibrating, it's gone far too much that way, but do you really think that that's possible? In this present situation that we found ourselves in for 40 years, when you've got three political parties that are essentially slightly different but the same agenda, in the terms of marketisation and commodifying everything, including people. I really struggle against seeing it change, but I totally agree with what you're saying. But in my experience, it's a bit, you're banging your head against a brick wall with a lot of this stuff at the moment without a total change of ethos and a total change of the direction of politics.
That's a tricky one because ultimately it would require political change. And the only person, politician, a leader of a party, I heard that seemed to recognise some of what I've been saying is Jeremy Corbyn. Yes. I think that within the profession, if the profession can get their act together and come out with a single voice, that would help things. And I think another thing is to recruit, where possible, parents, because there are a fair number of parents who would broadly agree with my lecture. They might disagree with a few things, but broadly they would agree with it. And because parents have such a greater voice now than they used to have, it's important that they're on side. But other than that, I don't hold out any great hope. I must say at the moment, and it would be ridiculous of me to become all optimistic and say, well, things can change. Although, of course, we do know over the last 50 years things do change quite dramatically. 1989, Brexit, and not all change has to be bad. But it often is.
I have a question from a gentleman there.
Right. Right. Thanks for that, Geoff. I would just like to suggest that we're not just talking about education in England, because this is in most neoliberal Western societies, the situation you're portraying applies equally there. And I rather would want to qualify what you said about pedagogical experimentation in schools is now out.
Right.
That is not my experience, and there's some interesting research at the moment that is now published by Herbert Altrichter in the University of Linz of what is happening to the governance of schools in German-speaking countries, such as Germany and Austria and parts of Switzerland. And this research is about what impact what is called evidence-based governance, which is what you were talking about, what impact that actually has as a feedback mechanism that persuades teachers, if you like, to comply with the logic of performativity that you talked about.
Yeah.
And their case study research in schools in German-speaking countries is that the proponents of evidence-based governance are rather disappointed because teachers seem to have found a way of complying creatively. I mean, in the first lecture I talked about creative compliance.
Mm.
And what Altrichter and his co-researchers in Austria are finding is there's a great deal of creative compliance going on in the educational system. In other words, the control hasn't yet reached a level, except in teachers perhaps who are particularly up against it and start teaching to the test. But those with a great deal more confidence go with the flow, with the logic of performativity. They hope that their kids will get good exam results, but they don't see themselves as being teaching for those results.
Right.
Now, I think my experience is that what they found out in the German-speaking schools in Austria and Germany and parts of Switzerland equally applies here in this country and indeed in the university. I mean, how many of us working in the university system would see ourselves as creative compliers? I certainly would, and I'm sure you would.
Mm. Okay, right. Well, yes, I completely accept that that bureaucratisation and transactional knowledge and is not total, and I also accept that that there's a degree of pedagogical experimentation, that teachers can't be controlled 100% of the time, and there are examples of schools that have an interesting, innovative approach, including, for example, a primary school in Norwich that has very much an approach centred around inquiry-based learning, discovery-based learning. So the picture isn't perhaps quite as bleak as I portrayed it, and I would totally accept that, and that teachers try and do the best job that they can. But when you talk about creative compliance, yes, but they're still complying. I mean, that's my point. And that was my point about Ian, the senior school manager who talked about the ways in which they complied with Ofsted. He knew perfectly well what he had to do in order to get Ofsted off his back and get the school rated as a good school or outstanding school or whatever. But he was still having to comply. And in the end, what that shows is that teachers in the end aren't trusted, and they're not given the kind of professional autonomy they need. And I'm not saying, by the way, that teachers can be totally autonomous, because they are, of course, accountable to parents, to the communities in which they live.
Can I just ask one follow-up question to that? Do you see then that compliance entails coercion? Because surely people can comply without feeling that they are coerced.
Ah, right. Yeah. When you look at Foucault's account of power and how that works, what he calls productive power, the whole point about it is to bring about compliance, a regime of compliance, without people feeling unduly happy and stressed about it. So, I wouldn't use the word coercion, but I certainly would use the word, disciplinarity, the word that Foucault uses in order to describe this state of affairs, where essentially you're not really being given the freedom to teach the children in the way that you think they need to be taught. And to me, it's a teacher sitting in front of the children who knows the children and knows their needs and requirements.
I realize we have 2 questions lined up, but I just wanted to involve Tom and Jeanette maybe before we move on, in case you wanted to say anything from your point of view as students on this tension between complying with rules and maybe advancing your learning interests. I'm not sure. Jeanette or Tom, would you like to say anything about that? I'll start with Jeanette, if you wish to say much.
I would say autonomy could be used more often in classrooms, especially when there's a wide variety of student needs. Quite often we had really advanced students who were bored and they weren't allowed to move forward because then that would be ahead, and that was clearly, the teachers wanted to do more with them, but they had to follow that structure. They had a little bit of leeway, but not enough to fully give all the students what they needed.
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting comment. Tom, would you like to add anything?
I think I agree with Geoff's position of education definitely needs some kind of balance between the kind of position of standards and more autonomy in the classroom.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to questions. There is one from the back.
Thank you. If I can make a couple of points. I started teaching in 1967, so I recognise a lot of the history that was talked about, and that's interesting. But I entered local authority work in the late 80s, advisor and ultimately participating in Ofsted. And I have to say that moving from the teacher's side of the desk to the greater view was very interesting and very surprising, because what you have to say about the teacher's autonomy was often abused hugely, and one saw quite terrible practice, really, and children were suffering as a result of it. And I think my reflection on that over a number of years was that things like mixed ability teaching, which I was a rabid supporter of in the 70s and 80s when teaching myself, was great for excellent teachers. It's not nearly so great for mediocre teachers, and as a result of that, children suffer. I think you can add to that the situation in Norfolk, and I expect in other places, but certainly in Norfolk, we had a situation where we had, at the time, a load of middle schools, which were 8 to 12 middle schools, which of course cross key stages. You had city schools here in Norwich, which were fed by 5 to 11 primary schools out in the county and 8 to 12 middle schools in the city. And however you make that work for 11-year-old children without some kind of national curriculum and prescription from, a bigger view of education than the individual school, I cannot imagine. So I do think we have to factor that in. The other point that I'd like to make, and for your comment, is that it's easy to say this, that and the other about politicians or whatever, but at the end of the day, politicians are in place because people put them in place. And, if we remember, as many of us do, this story about Bill Clinton with a little sticker on his desk saying, "It's the economy, stupid." Unfortunately, I would say, it is money that motivates a large number of people. And although, of course, lip service is paid to, well, I want my child to be happy and I want my child to be broader than just knowing stuff, at the end of the day, what will get politicians in power is if the schools which they ultimately control deliver in terms of income and so on for their children. And somehow, I think that is what we have to break. I'll close by, I expect you're familiar with the quote from T.S. Eliot, The Rock. All our knowledge brings us nearer to death, but nearness to death no nearer to God. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? The cycles of heaven in 20 centuries brings us farther from God and nearer to the dust. And I'm afraid that it's that kind of path that society as a whole is on, and education is simply the consequence of that rather than the driving force for it.
Right, okay. Do you want me to respond?
If you wish to comment, absolutely.
Yes, you've made a number of points, and first of all, the fact that the experience of education in the 60s, 70s and 80s wasn't necessarily all that good. I completely get that, and I would agree with that. And that's perhaps something I should have emphasised at the time. The progressive phase wasn't unalloyed a bliss by any means. And one of the problems, of course, is having a body of teachers that is truly professionalised, that they're all graduate teachers, that they've all had some kind of training, and the expectations have been set. But it seems to me it's the teachers themselves that need to set their standards in the same way that the medical council sets the standards for doctors, and that teachers need something akin to that, not exactly the same, but something akin to that, to make sure that teachers take their responsibilities seriously. I totally get the idea that the policy, even at the local level, can't be just left to individual teachers in the classroom. There's the school management, and there's also you were talking about a local authority. they have a perspective that the teachers don't have. And so I can see what you're driving at there. As far as the politicians are concerned, yes, I can see on the one hand why a politician might say, well, good heavens, we're spending so many billions of pounds on education. If I'm going to get re-elected, I have to convince the electorate that their money's been well spent. And so I'm not interested in, what I'm interested in is results and to show how education has improved. And the only way I can show that is by raising standards. But by showing that standards have raised whilst I was Secretary of State for Education, say. But they also have a responsibility as well. They have a responsibility to understand the nature of education and to promulgate that amongst their own electorate. The people. It's not just a question of politicians doing what they think the electorate is telling them to do. If you like, politicians have a duty, if you like, to educate the electorate in certain things. And that includes educate the electorate on the nature of education, which very few of them do.
I'd like to move on to the next question here from the front.
Sorry, it's quite weird speaking to a microphone and hearing your voice relayed back. We sort of kind of skirted on the question on how we change it, and I would quite like to just bluntly just ask the question in a more direct manner, which is just how do we get from A to B? How do we completely transform our education system, and what politically has to happen? In your lecture, you spoke about a schools council or reforming Ofsted and so on. These are effectively political demands, and in my opinion, how we get from A to B and how we achieve those demands is probably something like civil disobedience, frankly. I don't take any pleasure saying that, but it is effectively, in my opinion, going to have to result in people doing civil disobedience or direct action or doing things disruptive in order to recalibrate the balance of forces. So that requires unions, that requires also students as well. So thinking about the recent climate protests, it was students striking, right? It was students, leaving the classroom. So maybe we could think about not just teaching unions pushing for demands, but also students themselves and students engaging in disruptive action to transform their education and their children's education in the future. That's just my opinion. I'm just wondering what the panel might think of how we get from A to B strategically.
Right. Shall I?
Yes, and then I think it would be interesting to hear from all the panel.
Yeah, I think that's what you've said is really useful there. Civil disobedience, I can see how that might work. I don't think it would work if civil obedience ended up neglecting children's education, so that you need to find a way of not just leaving children on the side whilst you're doing it. But one thing I do agree with you is that if you wanted political change, then somehow you need to translate the idea of a non-instrumental education into a series of 4 or 5 political demands. And that's what my lecture hasn't done. So that's a deficit. But I grant you, if you were able to do that and then be able to explain each political demand, then that would be a massive step forward in terms, because you're absolutely right, the change will only come through politics.
So I would like to involve Tom and Jeanette again. And Tom, how do we change things? What would you say?
It's a difficult question, but I would certainly agree with the gentleman in the audience that it's probably very difficult to change the politics in our country without some kind of civil disobedience or protest towards political authorities in general. But I think there needs to be clarity on what those demands are as well.
Thanks, Tom. And Jeanette, would you like to say something on the same question?
Yeah, well, kind of bringing together the previous two comments, I think there is a funding issue, especially in public schools. Throughout my 7 years at high school, many extracurricular activities and anything outside of English, maths and science was being cut drastically, and a lot of students weren't left with options because that was the only high school they could go to. They did not have the options to do an arts GCSE, or we had a really, really good health and social care module that got cut during my time there. And hair and beauty, we had a whole salon for hair and beauty, which got completely cut. And I think that if students were to protest, that is something they could protest, is to push for other subjects to be available, because not everybody is good at English, maths and science. And a hair and beauty career is a very good and lucrative career to many students, which has been frankly ignored a lot.
Thank you very much. There is a further question from there's a gentleman with a microphone, but I'll be mindful of a further question.
Yeah, I think it's working now. Yes. I'm a dinosaur. As this previous gentleman said, I started teaching just before I finished my apprenticeship in a trade school. So this is completely different to the education which you've been talking about. There's a major difference between the secondary education, which I only picked your flyer up on Thursday, last Thursday, and I thought it was education all the way through, rather than secondary specific. So my comments are really from the, I think you call it tertiary. Does that still work? I did 6 years before I actually got to do the teacher training course, which is in Wolverhampton. Now, if you want to talk about discipline, my students are in the workshop or in the classroom because they want to be there. I emphasised at the beginning that what we're teaching them post-16 or post-17 is a way of earning a living in the initial stage. They're going to be changing within the next few years because progress is being made in all sorts of areas. Some professions will disappear and you have to change. I went from mechanical engineering to teaching computing. Small jump, except it went through the BBC computers in that sort of stage, which was a bit of a Wild West. Regarding the use of questions, I didn't have a fixed lesson plan in front of me, mainly because I used the overhead projector. We didn't have marvellous bits like this now. And I could just about time how long the lesson would take. But if you got a couple of questions which were interesting, you would chase them and then come back onto the topic, because that was hitting when the, what was it called? Something like when the iron is hot, you go for it then. It does have its drawbacks. I was teaching a group of first-year apprentices, and the college I was in at the time did teacher training as well. And I was asked if a potential student would come in and sit at the back. Now, he was already got high national himself, and so he knew what we was going on about. At the end of the lecture, he watched. Now, this was an evening. It was about a 3-hour lecture from about 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock. These lads had been at work all day, come in and listened, and when he came back to me afterwards and with the other lecturer, he said, "How on earth do you manage?" He said, "It was like a cricket match. You were the sort of wicket keeper, you catch the ball, it gets battered all over the place, but when the question goes out there, you answer it, it comes back, and you're back onto topic again. I think that means that you have to have teachers who really know their topic inside out. You can't be teaching straight from the book. Also, the range of students, they're not a single package. They range from those that have failed in the school system for various reasons. They come to further education and they can change from being on the dole, depressed and feeling no good in themselves. They go through a 2-year course, which we did, and work experience, which is very carefully monitored, means that they then find that what they are, they're going from being a school mentality to suddenly realising they're employable and they've got a future, which is a marvellous thing because you have managed to change someone's life. And that is the biggest reward. Is it fine, I think? I think I'll never stop there.
Thanks very much. I mean, that was very interesting. And I didn't mention vocational education, but it is so important because it's through a vocational education, through the acquiring of a vocation, in that sense, that a person can, it builds up their self-confidence and they can then become a full member of the community. And that's something that, and it's not just a question of employment, that's really important, but it's not just a question of that. It's a question of building up their confidence and so that they can then go out into the community and be a someone rather than a nothing. And I've mentioned vocational education, but I think it's really, really important. And in this country, we don't spend enough time figuring it out. In Germany, historically, they've spent much more time and resources on vocational education than we do in this country.
I know there is a further question from this side of the room, lady over there. And you probably closest.
So I'm actually a teacher at a sixth form. So what I found most interesting recently is like we do love being creative, but for every minute you spend being creative, encouraging your students kind of really explore the subject, there's a little voice in the back of your head going, the exam's in 3 weeks. And you have to cover everything because it is going to be detrimental to their grade at the end of the day. So as much as, we love doing that stuff, you have to then kind of backtrack and get back on topic really, really quickly. So COVID has been really, really interesting because as soon as the exams were scrapped, we were literally set free. We could do whatever we liked. And most teachers really ran with that and could look at skills and exploring the topics in much more interesting ways because they didn't have that end goal of they must be assessed on this, or they must know this, this and this ready for this date. Yeah. So actually we've had a taste of that. Right. And you'd like to think that might spur more consideration of whether exams are actually useful. But yeah, the second exams were cancelled, we were like, great, we can do all the stuff we've always wanted to do, but we are constrained by the requirements of the course and the assessment and that kind of stuff. So I really like the idea of having an actual teacher who has ever taught a day in a school in government would be nice, because you do need that understanding of how it all works. So all of the comments kind of just make me think, well, we want to, but we just can't. And every time we do, you then work 10 times harder to then do all the other stuff that you should have really been doing at the time that you were doing the creative stuff in. So I just thought it was really interesting. But COVID has been a taste of what we could be doing. Right. And we really did run with it.
Could I ask you a question?
Yeah, go for it.
When you change your teaching to explore these subjects because because of the change of assessment. Did the students respond?
Yeah, they really, really enjoyed it. They just had more time, because courses are designed to be hard by trying to teach too much in the time you have. So you're always racing against time to fit the content in, let alone the skills they need, let alone the time of when the exam and everything is. So taking away that time constraint, the students didn't feel that same pressure, and they could explore a little bit more. They were more interested in the tasks because they weren't kind of exam practice constantly, and that it was much more creative. So they got a lot more out of it in terms of skills, while still learning lots of the content that they would have learned anyway, but in a much more creative way and a much more kind of interesting way that did allow them to kind of go off topic and then come back. And it was completely different to any other year that we've taught, and that would be amazing. But equally, we had the stress of all that school's inflating their grades and we're not inflating our grades, and how's that fair? And the whole system in terms of having to have a grade was really stressful. But take that element away, and worrying about your students going on to compete against other university places and things like that, the actual process of teaching was brilliant, because there was no exam. You could just have fun with it. So it has happened. It's just obviously it couldn't be researched because of COVID, but it's a shame, because it's worth looking into, because we really could have fun.
Well, thanks very much. That sounds really interesting.
I just want, before we move on to the next question, to involve the full panel again on the subject of, would you like to say anything on the question of whether abolishing exams might actually be a way of improving quality of learning? Jeanette, would you like to make a comment there?
I think in my experience it would be easy. I think it also it will give students a bit more choice and variety of what they want to do. Kind of bringing it back a little bit, I remember when we were in year 11, the only options we were given were go to university. That was the end goal, and that wasn't because the students were good for university. That was because the school looked good if students went to university, and a lot of that was based just on those facts that a school would get more funding if their students had higher grades, and the grades that they were interested in were the English, Maths and Science. Whereas if a student had great grades in art and drama, they weren't recognised as, oh, these are good grades, you are well-received students. And also in the art subjects, I think it's a lot easier to have freedom in how you teach it, because the final result is a very different type of exam than the hugely compacted exams that you have for English and Maths, where there is a huge time restraint, and a lot more freedom in the art subjects.
Thank you very much. And Tom?
The gentleman over there, his comments about vocational training reminded me of some ideas from Nietzsche, and I just wanted to ask Geoffrey about it. This idea of discipline as a path to freedom, and whether that might be an idea to discuss.
Discipline
as a path to freedom.
Oh, the path to freedom?
Yeah.
What, in the kind of self-discipline?
Like, not in a complete way, that's not what I'm saying, but like, that you need maybe exams and standards to have some kind of effective education.
Right. What you need is some kind of assessment, but it doesn't follow that the assessment has to be in the form of an exam. Or it doesn't follow that all of the assessment has to be examined. Some of it could be in part exam and part coursework. The three components of education: curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. And you've got to have all three there. but assessment can take many forms, as can pedagogy. And I think that I'm not suggesting anywhere that all assessment equates to instrumentality.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't. It's part of the form of assessment, and also how often you're assessed as well. So yes, you do need a certain amount of assessment, and that does provide a framework of discipline in the sense that you were talking about from Nietzsche. Did you say?
Yes,
yeah.
Nietzsche.
Yeah. So that would be my answer. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you. We have a question from a lady over there, slightly to my left, about the middle of the room.
Thank you. I just wanted to jump onto your point first before I got to my question, because you made me think. I'm a year 5-6 teacher at a primary school, so kind of opposite end. But again, COVID did the same for us. Year 6 was, my first year in year 6 was the first year of the first lockdown, so I was just getting into that mentality of I've got to prepare these children for SATs, and then it all went out the window. And actually at primary, we were kind of forgotten about we didn't have CAGs to do, we didn't have any of that. It was just our usual end of year assessment, and it was really freeing. I actually ended up with a group of year 2 children in lockdown, and one afternoon we built rafts out of lollipop sticks, something we'd have never have done if it hadn't been for lockdown. So that was, it was really nice to just, like you say, experiment, go a bit more off piste. We didn't know what children we'd have in each day. Often we would just get a selection of children. You could have nursery children through to year 6 in your bubble that day, and you just had to come up with something that would entertain all of them, and it was really quite freeing. And then it does feel a real shame. This is now my 3rd year in a year 6 class, and it's going to be my first year of SATs, and I'm looking at these children going, oh no, like you've had 2 years of disruptive education, but the end goal hasn't changed. I've still got to get you to exactly the same point as I would have done if you'd been in school for the last 2 years. And it's kind of draining for the children, because they've got all this content that apparently they've missed and they've got to catch up on. But they haven't really missed anything. That's an arbitrary goal that's been set by someone in government that says I have to teach a 10-year-old the 12 tenses in the English language. Do they need to know that there are 12? Can we just stick with past, present, future? Do they need to know what a conjunction is and what its thought function? No. But there we go, that's what I've got to teach. So that was just an interesting point that I wanted to build on. But my question was, what do you think of the new Ofsted Framework? Obviously, previously, I know particularly in primary, there was sort of, because of the SATs, and especially when they dropped science as a subject, lots of schools suddenly focused on their reading and their maths and their writing and kind of ignored even science, even though it's technically core. So I guess in response to that, it seems to have been that we now have Ofsted who are going to come in and do deep dives. I was having a conversation with our PE lead at school today, who's fretting over, well, how is she going to show progression in PE, and how is she going to show assessment in PE from reception to year 6? And I suppose the thinking was that by Ofsted doing deep dives in more subjects, it would broaden that curriculum away from the core subjects. But I don't know, I just kind of wanted to know what you would think about the new framework and its approach to looking in more depth at other subjects.
Right. I'm going to confess I don't know that much about the new framework. Is there anyone else who does? Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly as my colleague is describing it, that it has a very narrow definition of what knowledge is, a very scientific definition of what knowledge is, a transmission model of knowledge, knowledge-rich curriculum, places a lot of emphasis on remembering things, and that learning is a change in long-term memory. In summary, would you agree?
Yeah.
Right. So the idea is that Ofsted is looking at the broader curriculum.
Yeah, so they'll come in and they can come in and do a deep dive, they call it, on
Yeah.
anything. They could come and ask you, what are you doing in DT
Right. Yeah. Mm.
They will ask, what are you teaching, in what order, why is that order the best order, and how do you know that the children will remember what you've taught them up until the end of a phase.
Mm.
You should read it, Geoff.
Do you feel that it's an improvement, or not especially?
I work with English teachers, so I train English teachers.
Yeah.
And in the discipline of English, it's like a straitjacket, because English is not about necessarily remembering things. I mean, we can teach our students to remember the plot of Midsummer Night's Dream and all of the characters and spell them correctly, but that doesn't mean they can engage in the interpretation of the text or have their own personal response. So for subjects like English, it is very difficult to kind of compromise with the new framework and its definition of knowledge.
So
it's a very scientific model.
Yeah. So it sounds to me, even if they're assessing a broader range of knowledge, the methods of assessing from an Ofsted point of view have changed very little.
Yeah, and yes, and they just have one definition of knowledge, but
right.
Aristotle had many different ways of defining knowledge. Thank you for today, Geoff.
Okay, thanks.
There is a little time for a final question if anyone is willing to ask.
Hello. As we've heard from several people about sort of the impact of COVID-19 on exams, I was in my final year of secondary school, year 13, in March of 2020, and actually I say I was overjoyed when my exams were cancelled, because a great deal of anxiety and self-worth trouble was lifted off my shoulders, and I'd be interested to know how the knowledge that you were going to be examined and that an examination is essentially a judgment on you impacted your well-being throughout your education.
Mm. Yeah. It's one of the interesting things, and I'm not an expert on exam systems, but I once attended a talk recently with someone who'd had a knowledge of different exam systems or methods of assessment in a whole range of countries. And he was saying that this country is definitely amongst the worst in terms of the emphasis on exams. That in other countries there's much more emphasis on coursework, on assessment, on teacher-based assessment in particular. Even in North America, where in some ways the education regime can be quite punitive, but even in North America, there's more emphasis on teacher-based assessment. So this country, and he used the phrase that this country is definitely an outlier in terms of the method of assessment and the concentration and focus on exams.
I would like to involve Tom and Jeanette if you want to say anything about the relationship between assessment and well-being. Jeanette, would you like to go first?
I think an interesting point I realised that nobody else has mentioned before today is that autonomy of students. That students do not have a choice in the exams that they take, and we have to take them. And there's a lot of pressure to take them. And we have had, especially in sixth form, students go into a lot of arguments with teachers that they don't want to be here. And they're like, but we don't have a choice, we have to be there. And I think if the pressure of exams was taken off, especially if you're not good at that subject and you don't want to carry on in that subject in the future, might shoot a very high level exam.
Yeah, we lost you a bit at the very end, but I think the the main message came through very clearly. So I will turn to Tom to conclude if you wish to. Yes.
Examinations are definitely a challenge, and there's definitely some pressure in it. You asking me personally?
Yeah.
I don't personally. I'm not very stressed over exams. I don't know why, but I just am. And I think I was very lucky with the school I went to, and the environment that I was educated in generally fostered an attitude to deal with any challenge that comes. But that's probably me. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right, well, on this note, I would like to invite you all to join me to thank Geoff, Tom, and Jeanette.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
One or two people have asked about education in the future, and that's what we'll be looking at in the final two talks. So the first one is next month, so there's one on March the 15th and another one on the 22nd, and we'll be looking at what education might look like in the future.
Yeah, so we hope to see you all there. Thank you very much.